scientist. He's worked at Brookhaven. He's worked at Los Alamos. He did a tour in Vienna at the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization. He spent a lot of time in the sciences, but he's also an ordained rabbi, which is an interesting mix. Somebody who can understand what the sciences are telling him is really happening, and also has the philosophical background to understand how we as humans should apply that knowledge. That's a very unusual combination. He currently is the rabbi for Hamakom in Santa Fe, and also in Los Alamos for the community up there. He's had a broad experience in many, many areas, and he's going to talk to us tonight about some of those. So let me introduce Rabbi Jack Shlachter.
Thank you, Stu. Thank you to Linda for your organization, for the meeting, for providing me with an opportunity to speak, and I love to speak to this group. Our keynote speaker and the panel that just took place both involved very personal and quite moving stories. My presentation is neither of those. This is just sort of an academic presentation. So before I launch into it, I do want to take a personal moment. Like many of you, I've been extremely disturbed by the events of the last 2 weeks. The atrocities on Shmini Atzeret 2 weeks ago were not only deeply troubling to me, but affect me personally, extended family in Israel. And this is the historical society. This is a Jewish historical society, and obviously we all have some connection to the events that have taken place. The theme of this year's conference is genealogy, and all I can picture with atrocities, massacres of innocent children are genealogies that were completely cut off without the opportunity to flourish the way much of what we've studied in Jewish genealogy has been. So I'm just going to ask you for a moment of silence as we reflect on the events of the last few weeks, and also if you are interested in taking some action. Yesterday, I believe, I forget now, it's been a kind of a blur, but yesterday was the third rally that I was part of. We led something in Las Vegas at the Montefiore Synagogue, and in addition to attending these rallies, I think there are things that we can each do. And I'm speaking personally. I'm not speaking as the rabbi of Hamakom or the rabbi of the Los Alamos Jewish Center, certainly not speaking as an employee of Los Alamos National Laboratory. I'm speaking as a human being, as an individual, as a Jew, as a rabbi. And if you are interested in taking some additional steps, I'm happy to provide information to you after the presentation. So I'm just going to ask for a few moments of silence. Thank you. I also want to give some credit to John and Mindy, if I got their names correct there, who are our audio-visual people, because they're going to bail me out when things go awry here. So thank you. They've been doing a great job so far, and they really worked hard to help me plow through some of the AV things on my presentation, but I may have to call them over to help me out as we go further into this. By the way, I'm fairly confident that this is a first for the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society. What you see up in the little images here at the top, and they're not that visible, you're going to see a much larger image of this one later on. But over here, does anybody know what that is? That's a Feynman diagram. I don't think you've had Feynman diagrams at the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society before. So I worked this talk backwards, just so you know. I really wanted to give a presentation this year. The theme was genealogy, and I know nothing about genealogy. So I I got interested in one particular individual who happens to be associated with this particular Feynman diagram. He was a scientist who worked at Los Alamos, a Jewish scientist who went on to win the Nobel Prize. We're going to talk about him towards the end of the presentation. But I looked at his background information, I read a biography of him, and it connected him with his great uncle, I think it is, and that connected things to the most famous, most studied Jewish genealogical family that I think ever existed. It started in the Central European area, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So this is going to be a genealogical talk. It's really just kind of a drive-by presentation about 15 different individuals from this genealogical chain, one of whom is this connection to Los Alamos. That was my way to get genealogy and, well, Jewish genealogy and New Mexico tied together. But mostly we're going to be talking and looking at individuals who have no real direct connection to New Mexico. So let me move on here. And we're going to start with the AV test here. Let's see how this works. I'm going to start with a song, I think. It's got to load because these things are connected to the internet. So let's see. I can't tell if it's doing anything. This is where I'm supposed to scream out, John, Mindy, come help me out. This is, I know we have people online, so I don't want to get away. Oh, there we go. We got something now. No, see, that's.
Is that the one you want to play?
That is the one, yeah. Oh, now try it, now try it.
There's a tiny house.
There's a tiny house
By a tiny stream.
by a tiny stream
Where a lovely lass
where a lovely lass
had a lovely dream.
had a lovely dream.
And the dream came true.
And the dream came true quite unexpectedly.
In Gilly for cats and Ellenbogen by the sea. She was out one day.
She was out one day
Where the tulips grow.
where the tulips grow
When a handsome lad.
when a handsome lad.
All right, sorry. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that song. If you are familiar with it, I'm sorry for you. I have grown to hate that song as I put this presentation together. But let's see if I can get back to some slides. If you listen to the lyrics of that song, I'm sorry, this just became a little harder than I really wanted it to be. Let's just move on this way. And then, yeah, well, and you know, I'm terrible at touchpads too. Okay, so, all right, so if you heard the lyrics of that song, you heard the name Katzenellenbogen by the Sea. That's why I picked that song, not because it's my musical favorite song. But as I had said, in the Rhineland, in my title of the talk, there is a town 50 miles west of Frankfurt in Germany called Katzenellenbogen, right here. This is not the best map. This came from Google Maps, but that's all I could come up with. Katzenellenbogen, it's a small place. It's about 2,000 people. There's a castle there. It's a small town. Translation of Katzenellenbogen is cat's elbow. Hence the title of my talk, From Cat's Elbow to Neutrinos. Neutrinos is going to bring us to Los Alamos and that Feynman diagram. But how did a town end up with the name Katzenellenbogen? It's probably, it's just that the words sound like the German words for cat and elbow, but probably this was a combination of some words that came from ancient German and from Roman. And you see it's perhaps derived from this Catamellibocus that doesn't have anything to do with cat's elbows. It was a tribe and mountains. That's probably where the name comes from. But for some reason, now it's called Katzenellenbogen. And that's the name of the family that we're going to be looking at genealogically. Does anybody, actually, maybe a show of hands, how many are familiar with that family and its genealogy? So if you do Jewish genealogy, my guess is you've come across this. This book is called The Unbroken Chain by Neil Rosenstein. This is volume 1. There are 2 volumes of this. This is the genealogy of the Katzenellenbogen family in the second revised edition. The newest edition is 6 volumes like this, costs a fortune. This volume, thanks to Temple Beth Shalom in Santa Fe, it was sitting on the discard table while I was doing the research, and I said, oh my goodness, that's the Unbroken Chain. I've been wondering if I should buy that. So I bought this. This was volume 1. It was diabolical, those Temple Beth Shalom people. They wanted me to have to buy volume 2 because volume 2 has the index. So this book was like of almost no value at all because I couldn't find anybody in it without the index from volume 2. But I did buy volume 2. And if you're really into this family, you need to know about Neil Rosenstein, who's still alive. He's in his 70s. He's a member of that family, and he's done an enormous amount of research on that family. And so I encourage you to look into this. By the way, when this talk was announced, I guess, I got a cold call email from a woman whose name I think is Susan Ellenbogen. She said she couldn't attend and she was going to Zoom, and now she wrote to me and said she wasn't going to be able to Zoom either. But she's obviously a member of that family. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are part of that genealogical chain. In fact, my son, who's a computer programmer, and I spent a little time trying to do a little bit of computer programming of a model for how many descendants there are in this family. And we made some bad assumptions because we came up with every Jew in the world is part of this genealogical chain. So I don't think that's quite right. We're still working on the model, by the way, but suffice it to say that there's a lot of descendants. What's interesting, though, is that there are many famous descendants, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you 15 of those stories in the course of this presentation. So there's a better picture of that one image, and if you look carefully, it's a cat, and the cat, because of Katzenellenbogen, is the symbol on all of the family tombstones in the city of Padua in Italy, of the Katzenellenbogen family. They all have that image on it. That particular one is on the tombstone of Rabbi Samuel Judah Katzenellenbogen, who's the son of the founder of the family. So I'm going to start with the founder of the family, and then we'll go on to look at 14 others in the family. So the founder of the family, Meyer of Padua, lived from about 1482, probably born in Katzenellenbogen, and that's where the family got its name, and died in Padua. That's why the cemetery is in Padua. He was a great rabbi. He was known as the Maharam Padua. Maharam is an acronym, just like Rashi, if you're familiar with the medieval commentator Rashi. It's an acronym. Maharam is also an acronym, and I wrote that out there. Marenu Harav Rabbi M something, so Rabbi Meir in this case. So Maharam, that's our teacher, the Rabbi Meir. But since there were many famous rabbis whose names started with the M sound, they have to identify his place as well. So he's known as the Maharam Padua because that's where he spent most of his time as a rabbi. He is the founder of this family. Family was widely dispersed throughout Eastern and Central Europe, and now, many, many generations later, it's dispersed everywhere, including Israel and the United States. So it's over a 500-year genealogy. And there were many distinguished people in that family. It was such an important family name. Get this, hundreds of years ago, if a man married into the family, he would change his last name to Katzenellenbogen because that was prestigious. So it makes the genealogy a little hard to trace because he might have come into the family by marriage, but he now has the name Katzenellenbogen. It's even more complicated than that, and I'm probably going to get myself a little out of order here, but let me say a little bit about this founder of the family. My friend Ellie asked me how many books I brought today. Only 3. I only brought 3. This happens to be a responsa anthology. So these are questions that people pose to a leading rabbinic figure, and then the rabbi writes a response. And they get collected together, and if you happen to be a big name rabbi, then it gets published. That's a cover photo of the publication of the responsa by Mayor of Padua. And I just wanted to select one of these responsa out for you, in particular because it's fairly liberal. And I think that maybe characterizes the family a little bit. So let's see. This is titled, "Must This Student Pay Tuition?" And when he lived, 1480 to 1565 or so. So the question is, a student fled from Venice at the time the plague was ravaging that city. And I think we can resonate a little more with the concept of people fleeing because of plagues now. Does he have to pay full tuition to his teacher, or may he subtract the period of his absence? That was the question that was posed to Mayor Katzenellenbogen. And he says it is a simple and unequivocal halakha, a Jewish legal teaching, that if an unavoidable situation prevents a teacher or a worker from performing his duties, the worker suffers the loss. Our case is analogous to this. The student's absence due to his fear of the plague certainly can be termed an unavoidable situation, etc., etc. And so he's putting a high priority on human life, as Judaism does quite clearly, and he is trying to be relaxed about whether the tuition has to be paid. I just thought you might enjoy that. Let's see. So this is a little more information about him and about the family. Katzenellenbogen, I can't even spell it without checking carefully. And it turns out that the family name is not spelled the same way as the town name, so that's another complexity. But then I mentioned that I'd gotten an email from somebody whose last name is Ellenbogen, so that just got easier, right, than having Katzenellenbogen. There are at least 12 variant spellings of the name and derivative forms. So you see on there Ellenbogen, Elbogen, Bogen, Katznelson, and then many of the people that we're going to be looking at in our drive-by presentation today don't have last names that have any connection to this at all, just the way genealogies work out, that somebody ended up with a different last name. And maybe sometime during the course of this conference, somebody can take a look at the unbroken chain and teach me how to even read it, because presumably there's a number there that tells you how many generations down you are, and it goes to roughly 20, I think, which is about what you might guess for 25 years per generation or something like that. And so there's this whole nomenclature with a letter and a number and another number, and I think it has to do with which chain of the genealogy you're following, and I didn't spend a lot of time trying to learn all that. But you now have been introduced to the founder of this family. The other ones will go more quickly, I promise you. I did want to say that he was an authority on Talmudic matters, and he was known as a liberal decider. This is pre-reform or anything like that, right? So there's only one Judaism, the way it should be today, right? That we're all just Jews. It doesn't matter. None of these titles are helpful, in my opinion. But he was on the liberal side. We're going to skip over his son, whose tombstone you saw, and go to his grandson. This is an individual who's known historically as Saul Vol. His last name really was Katzenellenbogen, if you can say that people had last names back then. You can see he was born in Padua, so now the family has relocated there and he's born there. He died presumably elsewhere because he went off for schooling. And I just want to share with you this folk tale about him. It's probably a bit embellished, but it's a wonderful story. He's the grandson of the founder of the family. He was a very important individual in Polish Jewish history. He is known by the nickname Le Roi d'un jour, King for a day. And Vol is the word that means the chosen one or the elect. But that's probably a backstory. That's not the actual origin of that name. But here's the story, at least in one variant. So at one point in his life, the Lithuanian noble Nicholas Radziwill wanted to do penance for many of the atrocities he had committed when he was a young man. And he undertook a pilgrimage. This is not a Jewish person at all. This is a wealthy Lithuanian noble. He undertook a pilgrimage to Rome to consult the Pope as to the best means for expiating his sins. The Pope advised him to dismiss all his servants and to lead for a few years the life of a wandering beggar. After the expiration of the period that was prescribed, Radziwill found himself destitute and penniless in Padua, Italy. So you get the idea of this story. This wealthy noble goes and does penance, and he ends up in Padua, and he doesn't have a penny to his name. So he appeals for help, and nobody's willing to help him. He's a poor beggar. But he finally appeals to Samuel Judah Katzenellenbogen. That's the father of Saul Wall, whose tombstone we saw. And Samuel receives this former noble, I guess, with great respect, treats him very kindly, and provides him with the means to return to Lithuania. He's very gracious. When the time for Radziwill came to depart, he asked the rabbi how he could repay him for his kindness. And the rabbi said, "My son Saul left some years ago to go study in the yeshiva in Poland, and I haven't heard from him. He doesn't call, he doesn't write, so I haven't heard from him. Could you find out if he's doing okay?" So Radziwill was very impressed so he goes back to Poland. He tracks down Saul, who's not named Saul Vol, he's Saul Katzenellenbogen at the time. He's very impressed by this young man who's been studying in the yeshiva, and he takes him into his castle and offers him support to continue his studies, and he encourages him to become sort of like a part of the household. So then what happens is in 1586, so Saul Vol is in his mid-40s, there's a dispute that takes place because the king of Poland dies. And the rules in Poland are fairly complicated. There's two different families, and somehow they've got to agree on who's going to be the next king. And there's a big fight about this, and they can't come to any agreement. And so this Radziwill says, you know what? I know the perfect guy who can solve this problem. We'll make him king until we can figure this out. And so this guy, Saul Vol, a Jewish guy, became the king of Poland. this is a true story at some level. We don't know exactly how this transpired, but he is known as having been the king of Poland in like 1586, possibly only for one day, because it may be that what the two warring factions of nobles could agree on is, this is not our answer, we don't want a Jew as the king of Poland, and so one day after that, they managed to come to some compromise. It might have been a few weeks later or something, but we don't know. Maybe it was just one day, but it wasn't more than a few weeks. In any case, while he was the king of Poland, he passed some laws, and those laws stayed on the books, and they were favorable towards Jews. My wife and I were just in Poland, and for the high holidays, I led high holiday services at a liberal synagogue in Warsaw, Poland. That's the subject of another talk sometime. But suffice it to say that the only tourist thing on my list was to go to the Polin Museum, which is a relatively new museum in Warsaw about the 1,000-year history of Jews in Poland. And it's such a chock-full museum that I couldn't find anything about Solval to back this up. So I guess I'll have to go back or something. But anyway, so he's the second in our genealogy that I wanted to spend some time talking about. Now here's an individual you may know. This is Moses Mendelssohn. And I said that up until the early 1800s, all Judaism was Judaism, right? But it's this guy, Moses Mendelssohn, who really caused Judaism to become somewhat more diverse. You can see that he lived from, and by the way, I ordered these slides, so it's going to be chronological by birth year. So everything's going to increase towards the present by birth year. So Moses Mendelssohn jumps us to the 18th century. Very interesting individual. And those of us who are Jewish and who are not Orthodox probably owe a big debt of gratitude to Moses Mendelssohn for making Judaism more like it is today than it was back then. He was largely self-taught. If you're familiar with the book Nathan the Wise, he's the basis for the character Nathan in that book. And he tried hard to promote the idea that Judaism is a religion. And so you could be a proud German citizen and be Jewish. It didn't catch on in Germany so much, to be honest. It caught on in the United States. That's why those of us who are American Jews find no problem thinking of ourselves as proud American citizens and Jewish, because we think of Judaism as a religion. It never was thought of that way before. Moses Mendelssohn is really the originator of that concept, And I think it's maybe a little bit of a stretch to say that there's really such a separation. I usually say Judaism is a family. And that we're distantly related to each other in some sense. His idea was not so successful for the future of Judaism in his own family. By 1871, there were no male descendants practicing Judaism from Moses Mendelssohn. So at least Judaism on that genealogical thread ends not long after Moses Mendelssohn. If you weren't familiar with his name, you probably are familiar with one of his grandson's names, and that's Felix Mendelssohn, the great composer. So Felix was not circumcised. He was baptized at the age of 7, so you can already see how this modern approach to Judaism has shifted into a disappearance of Judaism. I am fairly confident that it is an accurate statement to say that Felix Mendelssohn was both conscious and proud of his Jewish ancestry. He was certainly proud of his grandfather, Moses Mendelssohn, who was quite renowned as a philosopher. Mendelssohn, he was a great composer. I don't try to distinguish between how great this one was compared to how great this other one was. I love classical music. I read some criticisms of Felix Mendelssohn's music that, when he was young, he did a great job writing music, and then he never actually grew up, and so it's only his youthful stuff that's good. I don't know that I agree with that. And I had an audio clip here of one of my favorite pieces, the Hebrides Overture, but I think in the interest of trying to avoid problems, I'm going to skip over that audio clip. But I did create this slide as a parallel to the previous one. So if you look here, there's a portrait of Moses Mendelssohn and his tombstone in Hebrew. And here, there's a portrait of Felix Mendelssohn and his tombstone, and I think you can get the message of what I'm trying to say there. Okay, so, and he's like the 5th great-grandson of Saul Wall, the king of Poland, just to keep track of where we are in the genealogy. And like I say, we're moving along chronologically, so now we move to 1818. Another Jewish individual who's part of this genealogy, Karl Marx. So Karl Marx, born in Germany in 1818, the 9th great-grandson of Saul Wall. His family converted to Christianity before he was even born. And, you know, I'm sympathetic to it nevertheless, because you notice that it says there was an edict that prohibited Jews from being advocates, advocates being a technical term for some legal, profession. His father was a lawyer, and his father hit a glass ceiling because of his Judaism, and so the whole family got converted. And when Karl Marx was born, they were all Christian at that point. Both of his grandfathers were rabbis, and I've often heard it said that everybody can claim a great rabbi in their genealogy, maybe a grandfather or a great-grandfather. The real question is, what about your grandchildren? How many of them are famous rabbis? For Karl Marx, probably none is my guess. But certainly one of the most important and influential Jews in the history of the world, because if you think about it, communism has its origins in Karl Marx and his Communist Manifesto, which he co-authored with Engels in 1848. And I just have a quote from that. "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. The proletariats have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite." Pretty famous line that's had an important effect on the history of the world. So here's his tombstone in London, because he led a hard life as a political exile in England until his death. Das Kapital was published in 3 volumes. You can see most of it posthumously. And he had self-hatred toward Jews. But, as best I can tell, he was remarkably ignorant of Jewish history and Jewish culture. So it's unfortunate, I think, that he had become so disconnected from the Jewish roots of his genealogical chain. Now we come to somebody who may not be as well known as Karl Marx, but certainly has been important in the history of Israel. Yitzhak Yaakov Rhinus, who was born in Belarus in 1839. He was the pioneer, if you will, of what's called religious Zionism. So up to the point of Yitzhak Yaakov Rhinus, you could be Zionist or you could be fervently Orthodox, but you couldn't be both. Nobody could quite see how to combine those two. And Rhinus said there should be no separation between the two. You can be a Zionist and you can be Orthodox as well. And so he was the founder of what's called the Mizrahi religious Zionist movement, and that was very important in the shaping of Israel's future. He had a quest to create this new yeshiva, a study institution for rabbis, where rabbis would gain both knowledge of Jewish texts but also a secular education. And his ideal would be that somebody comes out of that school with a Ph.D. in physics and ordination as a rabbi. But he wasn't so successful. That school, I think, lasted only about a year. It's funding issues, right? He couldn't get other people to support this concept because for him, these things should be blended, And for the rest of the Orthodox world, there's a strong separation. Just share with you, and by the way, this is going to be important. He developed a new approach to text study, to Jewish text study, so Talmudic study, which had been very much this, how many angels dance on the head of a pin type stuff, what we call pilpul, or, just this reasoning that takes you into lots of abstract spaces that have nothing to do with reality. He wanted to approach texts analytically. That's very important, because if you think about it, this analytic approach to texts is also the analytic approach to science. And that's what he was really trying to promote, that you could be Jewish and you could be part of the modern world and approach the modern world that way as well. This is a quote from a book about him that I read called Pioneers of Religious Zionism. It says, "Hatred of the Jews is the result of a cause and will never disappear until the cause is removed. Only if the Jewish people return to its own land will it find refuge from this hatred and the mistaken feeling that they were responsible for it." How challenging to read a statement like that in light of today's events. Keep his last name in mind. Because I put these in chronological order, we're not going to get to his great-nephew right away, but we will. You may know this individual, Helena Rubinstein, another member of the Katzenellenbogen family, the 13th great-granddaughter of Saul Wall. So we're getting up now in the numbers. She was born in Krakow, and I didn't have time to incorporate pictures that we took on our trip to Poland into the talk, but we took a picture of the house that she was born in Krakow. It's got a plaque on it. She actually left Poland, and she ended up moving to Australia. She was a pretty strong woman, probably quite ahead of her time. She refused an arranged marriage, and so she left Poland and ended up in Australia. Now, the climate in Australia is pretty harsh, and her mother was known for this cold cream that she had developed. And so here, Helena Rubinstein finds herself in Australia with a bunch of women who are suffering from this harsh climate and knowing this recipe for her mother's cold cream. And what did she also do? Australia doesn't have a lot of people, but it has a lot of sheep. And sheep have lanolin. And so she incorporated the lanolin from sheep's wool into this cold cream remedy, and then was very successful selling this in Australia. She then came to New York. She arrived in New York in 1914, and I love this quote. Please don't be insulted by it. She remarked that American women had purple noses, gray lips, and chalk-white faces from terrible powder, and said, "I recognize that the United States could be my life's work." She was so successful when she died a half a century later, her estate was worth $100 million. She sent saleswomen on the road to demonstrate the right makeup for the average woman. She invented waterproof mascara. She invented medicated face creams. And she was very generous to Jewish causes and causes in general. She donated a pavilion that bears her name at the Tel Aviv Art Museum, which Beverly and I saw on our trip to Tel Aviv in May of this year, and we also didn't incorporate any photos from that. But you can go see the unique collection of 15 miniature period rooms that Helena Rubinstein created. And this is supposed to be a video. I'm not going to play it because it's just too frustrating. I think maybe later on, if you're interested, we can do it. But this is a video from the Tel Aviv Museum of Art about these miniatures. And you can see there's what looks like a room, but that room is like this big, you know. And there are 15 of these. That's a picture of her as this leading European cosmetician. And she was quite a tough cookie. She was known for these quips that she would make. One time there was a French ambassador who was intoxicated, and he was at one of her famous dinner parties, and the French ambassador said something in French, and Rubinstein asked her seatmate, what did he just say? And she said, he said, your ancestors burned Joan of Arc. And Rubinstein said, well, someone had to do it. Let's see, I want to do one more thing with her, and then we'll move on. Let's see. Yeah, there's a photograph of one of the miniatures as well, and this is another one of her famous sayings: there are no ugly women, only lazy ones. She was quite an entrepreneur. She was probably the first self-made female millionaire, and she knew how to advertise, and just very successful. Okay, a few other names that you should know. Martin Buber, a member of that family, the 9th great-grandson of Saul Wall, born in Vienna. Now you see some of the effects of Moses Mendelssohn, this individual, deeply religious but not orthodox in practice. His grandfather was also very famous and influenced him. His grandfather was a Jewish scholar, and Martin Buber basically grew up in his grandfather's house because his parents divorced when he was only 3 years old. He translated the Hebrew Bible into contemporary German, and you may not know that translation. He worked on it with Franz Rosenzweig. It's known as the Buber-Rosenzweig translation. But the rules that Buber and Rosenzweig developed for translating the Bible were the same rules that Everett Fox used when he did his translation of the Bible into English. And so if you want to get the best example of what that translation in German was like, go read the Everett Fox translation. It uses rules like words are repeated in the Hebrew which sound awkward to us in English because we're used to changing words and using synonyms instead of using the same word in the same sentence. But in the Hebrew, it's deliberate that you hear that same word repeated. And so the English in Everett Fox has that repetition because that was the Buber-Rosenzweig rule as well. Also, there was a belief that the Bible was meant to be listened to, not read as a book. People didn't actually used to read books, right? They used to listen to them out loud. And so when you listen to Everett Fox's translation out loud, you're linking yourself to Martin Buber. I show another photo of him later in his life, famous for this philosophical approach called I-thou, saying that that's the relationship that we can have with God, and it's the relationship we should strive for with other people. That rather than treating other people as objects who are there to serve our best interests, the ideal is to treat them as a thou. And, the German doesn't translate so well into English that way because we don't really use the word thou so much. But the idea is to treat individuals as fully legitimate individual human beings, not as things that are there to serve your purposes. Very interesting individual. The next person keeps our family name alive a little bit, at least in one of its variants, Katznelson. Itzhak Katzenelson, I don't know that I had heard of him before I started to do this work, but a very interesting individual. He was already, you can see, in the 40s, in the 1940s, he was already into his 50s, and he was in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which I learned much more about, having been in Poland recently. But because he was not a youngster, he's not one of these 20-year-old firebrands trying to fight the Nazis, the survivors in the ghetto managed to smuggle him out of the ghetto. Because he was in his 50s, he's not, so useful as a fighter, and he was quite a renowned writer and teacher at the time. He was given, it's an interesting story. The Germans at some point decided that they had a bunch of captured German soldiers, and they were going to be willing to trade for them, but only with foreigners who happened to be in German-occupied territory. So Katzenelson was given a falsified Honduran passport to make it seem like he was not local, right, that he had a Honduran passport. He was put into this transport that was sent to France to be like a holding pattern for all these people with these foreign passports until they could be exchanged for these German prisoners of war. And then, as I understand it, the Nazis changed their mind and murdered everybody on that transport, including Katzenelson. So while he was in France, he wrote something called Song of the Murdered Jewish People. And, you know, I think my heart is too heavy to read some of that to you. In the course of doing my work for this presentation, I purchased a translation of that in English. It's quite a moving document. I also purchased the diary that he wrote in France before he was sent off. It's probably, it was supposed to be delivered like today, so it's probably waiting for me at home. But a very tragic individual, but an interesting one nonetheless. Abraham Joshua Heschel, another person from this family. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about him. There's the iconic photograph of him walking with Martin Luther King. You see him here with this wreath around his neck and Martin Luther King. Born in Warsaw, Poland, and managed to get out. And, you know, his famous quote that when I marched in Selma, my feet were praying, because that march took place, I believe, on Shabbat, and he was criticized for participating in it on Shabbat, and he said that it was his feet that were doing the praying. Very interesting individual, and you know probably of his daughter, Susanna Heschel, who's quite a prominent scholar as well. So this one probably doesn't ring a bell with anybody here, maybe, but Herb Anderson was a scientist at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project era. I remember seeing him around Los Alamos because he suffered from a disease called berylliosis, and people used to work with beryllium in experimental physics without realizing the health hazards associated with it. He managed to get some of that into his lungs. He developed this reaction called berylliosis. He always was walking around Los Alamos with an oxygen concentrator. This is decades ago. You can see he died in 1988, but I remember seeing him there in the early 80s. He was basically Enrico Fermi's right-hand man. He was there in Chicago when the first pile was operated as a chain reaction, and was a very important scientist in the Manhattan Project. Went on to go back to the University of Chicago and had a very long and distinguished career there. All right, I bet you know this individual, Yehudi Menuhin, the great violinist, considered one of the great violinists of the 20th century. I love some of these, you know, over-the-top stories. First public appearance at age 5. At 7 years old, appeared as solo violinist with the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra. But really connected with his Judaism, as you can see, he performed for the surviving inmates of Bergen-Belsen in 1945. Here's a newspaper quote from his presentation in Berlin in 1929 at the age of 13. This must have been his bar mitzvah project, right, to perform in Berlin. And here's what the critic said. There steps a fat little blonde boy on the podium and wins at once all hearts as in an irresistibly ludicrous way. Like a penguin, he alternately places one foot down, then the other. But wait. You will stop laughing when he puts his bow to the violin to play Bach's Violin Concerto in E major number 2. All right. Now, I told you about Rhinus. This is the Rhinus who triggered the whole talk, because he is the only scientist whose work was done while he was an employee of Los Alamos National Laboratory, actually Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory at the time. His work that he did there in the 1950s went on to win him the Nobel Prize in Physics. That's the only work done at the laboratory that was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics. He is the great nephew of the rabbi that I talked about earlier, Yitzhak Yaakov Rhinus, who was the founder of religious Zionism. So Fred Rhinus came to the Manhattan Project in 1943 or 44, I'm not sure, and he worked on the bomb and then worked continually on weapons development for about another decade. And in the middle 1950s, he wanted a break. And what was it that he wanted to work on when he took this break? He wanted to find experimental evidence for the most elusive particle known, called a neutrino. And that was that Feynman diagram that I showed before. And he was asked by his boss, why do you want to detect the free neutrino? And Rhinus said, because everybody said you couldn't do it. That's why he wanted to do it. And he brought that analytical approach that his great uncle had developed as yeshiva study, he brought that approach to his physics. So an interesting situation. There he is with one of his detectors. He had a wonderful singing voice, by the way, and I understand that he did some study at the Met. He had a vocal coach at the Met and used to sing in Los Alamos. And then when he went on to Cleveland as a faculty member at Case, he sang with the Cleveland Orchestra Chorus under Robert Shaw and performances by George Zell and the Cleveland Orchestra. He actually founded the physics department at UC Irvine, and he finished his career at UC Irvine. He did come to Los Alamos late in his life. He wasn't awarded the Nobel Prize until like 40 years after the work was done, because the Nobel Committee did not like the idea of giving the prize to somebody who was associated with a weapons laboratory. It was so clear that the detection of the neutrino deserved a Nobel Prize. Everybody knew that, but they just hemmed and hawed for about 40 years. And late in his life, after he won the Nobel Prize, I think in 1996, I think he won the prize, he came to Los Alamos. I got to see him. Two more individuals, I think, and then we're done. Rebbetzin Esther Jungreis, I don't know if you're familiar with her, an Orthodox rabbi's wife, who was named Woman of the Year by Hadassah. She was the author of 2 books that I have, and maybe a few others as well. She's the author of The Committed Life and The Committed Marriage. She was sent on a train to Auschwitz, but that train got diverted to Switzerland. It's an interesting story, by the way. You know, the Jews of Hungary were sort of a last-minute thing, right? The Hungarian Jews had been protected for a while, and then it was Eichmann, more than any other individual, who sent them all off to Auschwitz. And there was some effort to save some of them, and it required a lot of money, and it's a complicated and somewhat difficult story. But she happened to be saved by being on that train. This is the last individual, I think, Deborah Lipstadt. So if you don't know who she is, you need to know who she is. She's the only one in the list who's alive today, with the most recent birth year, 1947. And she is now President Biden's special envoy for monitoring and combating anti-Semitism. And goodness knows we need this. So she is quite an outspoken individual. I've heard her speak in Santa Fe. She is connected to Emory, but she's probably on some kind of a leave right now. She served a couple terms on the Holocaust Memorial Council, and she, you know, more than anybody, has been very vocal in combating anti-Semitism from a political perspective. So I think we owe her a debt of gratitude as well. I'm gonna, in the interest of time, I'm gonna skip the song I had for you at the end here, which was supposed to be a little lighthearted, from the Reduced Shakespeare Company. I think it was courtesy of the Israelovitzes who are here that I became aware of this song called Begatten. It's about genealogy, but it doesn't actually mention the Katzenellenbogens, so I think we will skip over that. And instead, I'll just give some acknowledgments and references, and happy to field questions. Thank you very much. I think you should wait for a mic because of the online people. I put my contact information on this last slide, by the way, in case anybody wants to get in touch with me afterwards.
My question is about these latter members of this very interesting family tree. What were their relationships, or did we run out of great?
What I can tell you is
Okay.
if you go in this book,
Thank you.
You can see things that say G18.1, and that's somebody who was born in 1964. So, this genealogy goes on, and if I had the more modern one, it would be even easier to look these people up, because the 1990 edition, the index, which I paid, some money for, the index only has last names. In the more recent edition, the index has their first names as well, so it's much easier to find an individual. So I gave up at some point in my research because, like, if I wanted to look up Esther Jungreis, because I knew she was from that family, all I could find is Jungreis, and now I'm like going through this very dense material. It just was a waste of time. But they are, Neil Rosenstein has figured it all out. He knows exactly where they are in the family tree.
I have a question about the other side of it. How do they decide who is the founder of this family? Who came before him?
Yeah, no, look, even I, with no genealogical knowledge at all, know that he didn't just spring, from nothing, right? But the name didn't come about until him. So I think that's why they decide that's where we're going to start this tracking. By the way, I saw that in the conference title or whatever, it says something about DNA, doesn't it? Or something about, I forget exactly what it says, but what's the third word in our genetics? Yeah, I knew there's something like genetics. There is a very lengthy research article online about the DNA studies on the Katzenellenbogen family. So if you actually want to go into that aspect, you can do that too. But I think because of this last name, they just sort of start with Mayer Katzenellenbogen. That's where the last name started.
Thank you for such an interesting talk. I've heard other talks on such diverse subjects that you've given previously, so I ask, how long have you been preparing this subject?
I'm troubled by how honest I should be with this answer. I came up with this topic when the announcement came up where they're open for submissions. I put together the title. I knew that I had Fred Rhinus and the Katzenellenbogen family. I had those two endpoints. I threw in an abstract because if you go to Wikipedia and you look up Katzenellenbogen family, you see this listing of a bunch of people, right? So I kind of had this idea of the talk when I submitted the abstract, and then I was very busy. And what was good about this talk is I could work on it piecemeal. So if I could snatch, an hour of free time, I could do one more individual or something like that. So it took me a few months to put this talk together, but I never had an The last few months have been very busy, let me just tell you. So this finally came together like last weekend, and I figured that's as much as it's going to be for the presentation. I enjoyed putting it together because I learned about a lot of these people. And it was really good to have looked at some of these names before our trip to Poland. So, for example, we saw stuff about Helena Rubinstein. We saw stuff about Katzenelson, the martyred individual who was smuggled out of the Warsaw Ghetto. So we saw some things that I'm sure I wouldn't have seen if I hadn't, planned to do the talk. But really, I was a little freaked out when I saw the subject for this conference because I knew I don't know anything about genealogy. But I'm determined that I want to talk about Fred Rhinus, and okay, here's a way to bring it in. Thank you.
Okay, Rabbi, I just want to tell a little personal story that is connected. Okay, several years ago, I was in a coma, let's put it that way, okay? You were there. And I don't know, were you folks there? Right, and my wife would visit me in the ICU every day. She'd bring her Kindle and play music, classical music, because I liked music and she was trying to, you know, get me going there. So at one point, this is her story. She says, at one point, I yelled, Mendelssohn! So that was a clue to her that I maybe would get out of this coma. And
Wow.
so Mendelssohn has a very
Wow.
close place in my heart.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. It doesn't look like we have other questions. I just want to say, on the program, it lists Havdalah and Motzi, but somehow either I screwed up or I forgot to look at it carefully.
Probably
or whatever.
us.
But Havdalah is not until 7 o'clock tonight, is my understanding. So I think what we'll do is we'll do Motzi for those who want to do it, and then maybe anybody who wants to participate in Havdalah, we have to be out of here, I think, by 7:30.
Absolutely.
So just, you know, right at 7 o'clock, if you want to join me for Havdalah, we'll do that out there.
Jennifer, was there anything from the chat room?
Yeah, sure. By the way, I had forgotten, that first reference up there is that DNA article where you can see that Neil Rosenstein is one of the co-authors. I couldn't make it through that article. Not only don't I know genealogy, but I've never done 23andMe. I don't know any of that genetic stuff. So, but it's a long article, certainly. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.